let me first start by doing a little bit of a reality check that Japan actually has been going through for the last decade almost. As you all may know, Japan, economically speaking, have gone through 2 decades of lost decades. I mean, they first started out by saying, oh, it's lost decade. It's going on for more than 2 decades. I'm not quite sure how to call that, but they're still doing that, despite whatever Prime Minister Abe might like to perceive his own situation. But at the same time, here's a couple of reality checks for you when you compare China and Japan side by side. Chinese population, as of August 2017 statistics, roughly 1.3 billion. Japanese population, on the other hand, 1 digit lower, full digit lower. As of October 2018, about 126.4 million. So Japan is so much smaller, and Japan is shrinking. Japan is a hyper-aging society, and I don't mean to be disrespectful to the imperial family, but if you see the construct of the Japanese imperial family today, that is actually a great symbol of how rapidly Japan is aging. Because there's only one young male child who could inherit the throne. We have Japan is going through imperial succession this year, and that is quite unhistorical. That was actually quite unprecedented. But when we have an emperor who's reaching 85 years old, but he has to demonstrate his fitness as an emperor by playing tennis outside, there's something wrong about that picture. So he's going to hand it over to his son. But then after that, next in line normally would be his male children if he has one, but he has a daughter. So it's going to go to his nephew, who is still a school-age children. So he's going to have to marry either really early and expect that his wife will give him lots of children, or imperial family has to, and actually government of Japan has to think fast about how to make sure that the imperial line of succession continues. But then again, that is less number of the younger people supporting the older generation. So that is really actually symbolistic of how quickly Japan is aging. So that's just population. China has already surpassed Japan economically in the size of its economy back in 2010. So Japan has been no longer a world's second largest economy anymore for quite some time now. And everybody actually, and then since the Prime Minister Abe, I'm happy to talk about this in Q&A. Since Prime Minister Abe came back to power in December 2012, we keep reading in Western media about how Japan's defense budget is growing. Let me rephrase that. As of last year, nominally speaking, and Japan actually economy is pretty deflated, so probably it's pretty static. Nominally speaking, though, last year Japan had spent about roughly the same as it was spending back in 1997. So it's not an increase, it's actually a recovery to where it was before this lost 2 decades started. So let's set that as a context. So Japan has to grapple with 2 realities. One reality is that China will be always bigger, more populous, and for the foreseeable future, stronger. When Japan is, for the lack of better words, will likely to go down a trend line of shrinking. Its economy is still hasn't quite taken off yet. And even despite this whole lot of discussion of increase of Japanese defense spending, they're actually recovering from that lost 2 decades. And this is the bottom line. Japan cannot change geography unless there's another climate change and glacial continental shift, and somehow Japanese archipelago moves away from China. They're always neighbors. So how does Japan deal with that? So where does that, Japan's policy is a baseline, or bottom line, if you will, vis-a-vis China. So as Japan thinks about this, it actually means, and it comes back to this one point, which I'll probably come back to this again. Japan really has to be pragmatic about when it thinks about its relations with China. Meaning, Japan will always seek a relationship with China that is functional. It does not mean that Japan agrees with China on all the issues. And as Wu Xinbo just alluded to toward the last part of his presentation, there are some serious disagreements between Japan and China on issues that are quite sentimental, emotional, but then also the issue that has to do with a sense of its sovereignty. So it's quite hard to disentangle that when neighbors go at it at that level. But at the same time, Japan also recognizes, and also I believe China recognizes that too, and then I think that is why, since last year, relationship between the two countries have been actually on the improvement path, that it actually does share concerns and interests in many other important issues that both countries are facing. Let me just list a couple of examples. For example, energy security. Both Japan and China are energy importers, big energy importers. Countering environmental pollutions. Japan, back in the 1960s, 1970s, it does have a history of addressing the industrialization-related pollution. So it actually has this experience that it is quite frankly, happily share with China as it goes through its own industrialization process, dealing with air pollution and then other types of industrial-related pollutions. Aging. I talked about Japan's aging, but China is also aging too. And in fact, when Prime Minister Abe visited China, and when he was meeting with Premier Li Keqiang, one issue that two leaders really got excited to talk about and actually have a great conversation was on how each country should deal with the societal problem that comes with the aging population. So those are just a few examples of the important issues that Japan and China actually does share concerns and actually can collaborate and should work together. And I do think that, like I alluded to, Japan always seeks areas that it can potentially cooperate with China. Kaiser's presentation, I talked a lot about AI, founding emerging technologies. This didn't, unfortunately, attract a lot of attention. But at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Prime Minister Abe talked about the need of all the stakeholders in this issue, which includes both China and Japan, ought to be starting having a conversation about the digital governance. And this is really important point that Prime Minister Abe said that he would really like to start the process of this conversation at G20, not G7. Because G7 doesn't include these emerging powers. It doesn't include India. It doesn't include China. So he'd rather have this conversation starting at G20, and just by coincidence, Japan hosts that G20 in Osaka, June this year. So I'm pretty sure that has something to do with that too, to add his motivation to it. And like my previous speaker spoke about on maritime security issues too, two countries are working together to minimize the risk, improves the chance of de-escalation if something starts by accident, and try to come to some understood process and procedures if accident happens, who goes to rescue for whom, and things like that. So those are some of the concrete things that two countries are working together. And this pragmatism and pragmatic approach that Japan has been taking with vis-a-vis China is actually quite consistent with Prime Minister Abe's vision that he's always had about Japan's relationship with China. As many of you know, probably all of you know, his current term in the office is a second time. He was first time the prime minister between about 10 months or so between 2006 to 2007. Almost all Japanese prime minister, when they first become a prime minister, they try to come to Washington, D.C. as soon as possible. Race to the White House is real for Japanese prime ministers. But in his case, he chose to visit Japan and South Korea first in 2006. And he's the one who first started, who actually used the phrase when Japan talks about the vision for its relationship with China as mutually beneficial relationship based on common strategic interest. And that approach is very present in this current government's approach toward China as well. And so in a sense, I'm very actually encouraged that the two countries have actually come to find a common ground. What I really don't want Japan and China to see, I don't think it's in either country's interest, is to have this sentimental or nationalistic sentimental issues or disagreements. It's an important disagreement that they will not ignore, and it's very hard to overcome, to basically sabotage the entire relationship. So that Japan and China continue to almost agree to disagree and continue to have a conversation about how to resolve that area of disagreement. But in the meantime, they can have a room to work together and collaborate and sometimes lead the regional efforts depending on the area, depending on the policy area. So I very much hope that President Xi will be able to visit Japan this year. I think Prime Minister extended an invitation to him when he was in China last year. And as I said, there's an imperial succession happening this year in Japan. And usually the celebration for that imperial succession provides a great opportunity, probably, for the world leaders to come, and hopefully something very positive coming out of that from those gathering of the world leaders that I see. But what else is Japan is up to? What drives Japan's policy these days, not only for its policy toward China, but everywhere else? Wu Xinbo talked about Chinese effort in Asia has a lot to do with US also. In Japan's case, absolutely. US plays a big part in Japanese calculations about how it wants to organize its foreign policy. And we can definitely talk about this a little bit more as we move on to the discussion. But this administration, some of the policy decisions, we already talked about the American withdrawal from Trans-Pacific Partnership or Paris Climate Accord, and our president's threatening to withdraw US from the NATO. That really impacts Japanese thinking as well, because Japan's only treaty ally is with the United States. Japan always turned to United States as the ultimate security guarantor. And now, increasingly, we're in the area, at least in Japanese leaders' mind, that regardless of what they may hear from government officials that they work together, they're getting very different message at the political level. So they frankly don't know which one to believe. So this drives them to, I wouldn't say hedge, because that has a negative connotations and very reactive. But that would definitely motivates them to rebalance their effort a little bit. So it includes doubling down on continue to put an effort in reaching out to China. It also wants a little bit more wiggle room, a little bit of a diplomatic maneuvering room on its own too. It's reaching out to Russia, but it also invests its relations with the other partners in the region who shares this anxiety about US commitment in the region and sustainability of the US leadership in the region. Because this particular administration, and I think you probably agree, is highly unpredictable. And there is no guarantee that the next president in will be sane and predictable and rational. And what we know about American politics back in 2016, we really don't know, right? So we all have to go and vote. We can't slacking. So what does that do? So Japan has been investing a lot of time and energy in reaching out to NATO partners, Australia, India, and especially with India, it actually is also talking about the infrastructure cooperation in South Asia region, just as Japan and China have begun conversation about how Japan can work with parts of the project under the Belt and Road Initiative on the infrastructure development, or how Asia Development Bank and AIIB may be able to find a common ground and maybe work on a project together. And Japan also is really trying hard to salvage the remnants of the multinational agreements that this Trump administration left. So President Trump withdrew US from the TPP, but Japan worked with other nations who have already signed up to Trans-Pacific Partnership and basically salvaged it. And we often call it TPP 11. If you're mean, you can say TPP minus US. And if you better be really wonky about it, you can say comprehensive program for a Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP. And just as the EU is really nervous about this bilateral trade approach that the Trump administration is taking, Japan decided to go ahead and conclude. It was not an easy negotiation, but they concluded economic partnership agreement with EU, which had gone into effect. So both of those economic frameworks have gone into effect. And Japan is, with China, working really hard on the negotiations on RCEP. And Japan, China, and South Korea are working together about how to deepen not only economic cooperation, but then also how to increase people-to-people exchanges at grassroots, students level, youth level. And again, those are the areas that you don't see the effect right away on a policy impact. But I think 3 countries' leaders agree that those exchanges at the very young age will have a long-term impact in terms of creating a baseline about mutual perceptions, and it's a confidence building, and improve the mutual understanding. So you can call all that as hedging if you want, but I would say it's more about Japan looking at the reality that it has within itself, looking at the reality that it faces outside, and adapting to those changes. Because still, Japan's relationship with the US is the most important relationship. Like the late American ambassador to Japan, Mike Mansfield, said, US-Japan relationship is the most bilateral relationship, bar none. Actually, Japan embraced that much more so than the American, in some cases. So where does that leave us? So I'm going to finish off with a couple of points that I want to leave you with. So like I said, Japan will always remain steady in terms of its continuous effort to seek areas of cooperation with China, because this bilateral relationship is too important for Japan to go south, go down on a haywire. They're neighbors, they will remain neighbors. So it is very important for Japan to have that functional relationship. It's great if atmospheric is favorable and positive. We may not always get that, depending on the developments, on the areas of disagreement that two countries have. But still, the bottom line is it's hugely important for Japan to have this relationship with China as a functional one, that even at the worst time of political tension, there are some way for two countries, government leaders and officials, to communicate with each other so that minimize the understanding to the extent possible, and in case of areas of disagreement, minimize the risk of something that might have been accidental spiraling out of the control. So search and rescue agreement or unexpected encounter code of conduct, which is the basic procedure of what to do, those are, in a sense, institutionalizing these conflict prevention mechanism and tension reduction mechanism. And it's good for two countries to work on this when relationships are good, then both countries scrambling to figure out what to do when time actually did get bad. So I'm fairly optimistic about the near future of the Japan's relationship with China, but I very much look forward to what all of you have think about it after spending a few minutes with me. Thank you very much again.